Enough. I will not be silenced just because of the color of my skin.
There are procedures, and authority does not belong to you.
Procedures mean nothing if they cost lives. Justice demands courage, not excuses.
Then prove that your courage is worth more than my power.
The air between them seemed to crackle, every passenger holding their breath as if the fate of the night balanced on that exchange. Danielle's defiance burned in the cabin like a flare against the storm, while Gregory's authority pressed down like ice sealing steel. For a heartbeat, silence ruled, yet beneath it, truth and prejudice collided, ready to decide far more than who held the controls. Was this the moment when courage would finally outweigh power, or would injustice find a way to silence her again? The story does not end here. Danielle is about to face an even greater trial that will test the very meaning of justice. If this moment made your heart race, leave a comment with the word justice and follow to see what comes next. Holiday music drifted through the terminal at San Francisco International as garlands and soft white lights turned the concourse into a winter postcard. Travelers lined up at a Starbucks near the gate, murmuring kind wishes to the barista and slipping $1 or $2 into the tip jar before hurrying away with paper cups that steamed against the December chill. On the departure screens, a ribbon of urgent news crawled below the flight times, warning of a record blizzard swelling over the Great Lakes. Most people glanced up and then down again, hopeful that weather lived far away from their own plans. A Boeing 747 waited at the window, its silver body catching the last smear of sunset over the bay. Danielle Carter, in a worn denim jacket and sneakers clean but unassuming, took the aisle seat in economy and stowed a small canvas duffel beneath the chair. She had the satisfied exhaustion of a person who could sleep anywhere. Chin tucked, hands folded, breath steady. A pair of children traded holiday stickers across the aisle. Behind them, a retiree folded a copy of the Times and slipped it into the seat pocket, then thumbed the rosary with the practiced tenderness of old habit. A young man scrolled through a to-do list on his phone and, with a resigned smile, typed a reminder to Venmo his nephew for helping shovel snow last week. Overhead, the bins slid shut in a chorus of latches. A flight attendant moved along with a practiced kindness. "Good evening, sir." "Good evening, ma'am. Please make sure your seatbelt is fastened low and tight across your lap." The tone was soft, efficient, distinctly American in its warmth and boundaries. Up front, beyond the blue curtain, passengers eased into first class with a quiet ceremony of polished shoes and leather carry-ons. Gregory Stanton adjusted a cufflink and lifted a glass of seltzer as if it were something stronger. He told his wife, Linda, that he preferred flying during the holidays because the service felt more attentive. She smiled without answering, the kind of smile that asked for nothing more than a quiet flight and the chance to land on time. Gregory made a point of setting a crisp bill on the cocktail napkin for the flight attendant, then announced, a little louder than necessary, that good service deserved good tips. He tapped at his laptop, a portfolio blooming open like a city skyline, numbers and charts marching across the screen in precise columns. When the news ribbon returned to the storm, he scoffed that airlines always overreacted. In the cockpit, the calm choreography began. Captain Robert Hayes, a man whose face had been shaped by years of polite smiles and headwinds, ran his checklist with a steady baritone. Ethan Miller, newly promoted first officer, matched him item by item. They spoke in the relaxed, rhythmical phrases of people who know that precision can be kind if practiced gently. Ethan, who had grown up watching jets take off over Lake Michigan, had the alert brightness of someone who loved both the science and the poetry of flight. He mentioned the latest weather update with a measured no wind strengthening over the heartland, gusts predicted to stiffen as midnight crept closer on the East Coast. Hayes nodded, untroubled, and reassured him that winter knew how to growl for effect. They would climb high, settle smooth, and work with dispatch if the routes needed adjustment. Boarding finished with a rustle and a sigh. Coats were shrugged off, books found their place, seatbelts clicked. A toddler began to hum along with the carol piping through the speakers. The plane pushed back, and the lights of the terminal slid by like a string of pearls. As the jet angled toward the runway, the captain's voice smoothed over the cabin. A welcome, an approximate flight time, an invitation to sit back and enjoy a quiet ride to New York. A woman in the middle seat texted her daughter to leave the porch light on. A grandfather in a wool cap murmured that if they were lucky, they might get a view of the Sierra Nevada. And if not, well, there was always the map channel. The aircraft gathered speed. In the back, the acceleration pressed Danielle into the cushion, and her eyes closed with reflexive ease. The big jet lifted, wheels tugged, and the lights of San Francisco scattered beneath like confetti. A hush settled. Trays came out and slid back in. Once the seatbelt sign blinked off, a slow river of passengers stood, one by one, stretching the stiff places, excusing themselves with soft apologies, returning with paper cups and small bags of pretzels. The attendants moved with a friendly briskness, checking on elderly travelers, answering questions about connections and weather, offering an extra blanket when a draft slipped under the window shade. Someone asked if tipping flight attendants was appropriate. The attendant smiled and said that kindness was always welcome, but company policy did not require it. The cabin dimmed to a warm twilight. On the seatback screens, a map traced the arc eastward. The news crawl, for those who peeked at it, insisted on a storm that grew in both size and name. The phrase lake effect bands repeated like a drumbeat. It was a sort of information travelers acknowledged the way they acknowledged an ache in the knee. Persistent, but not yet defining. Perhaps, they thought, the pilots knew a secret pathway above it all. Gregory leaned across his aisle to tell a man he had just met that airlines oversold turbulence like a sideshow. He assured the stranger that private jets did everything smoother. The stranger nodded in that agreeable way of people trapped at 30,000 feet with a talkative neighbor. Linda watched the ice clink in her glass and asked her husband, gently, to lower his voice. He complied for a handful of seconds, then returned to emails with an air of magnanimity. In economy, a college student offered to swap seats so an older couple could sit together. There was a soft round of thanks, and the student returned to his audiobook with the contentment that comes from doing one small thing right. Beyond the windows, the night deepened, the wind lights blinking, a patient metronome against it. Clouds gathered in soft-edged layers, and every so often the fuselage trembled as if someone had drummed fingertips against it. The attendants paused, looked at each other, and resumed with minor adjustments. Cards secured a little tighter, coffee poured with a steadier hand, a reminder to keep belts fastened while seated. A boy announced that he loved when the plane wiggled like that. His mother tapped his knee and reminded him that not everyone loved it as much. Ethan watched the weather dance on the cockpit displays and checked the updated route proposals that air traffic sent like notes in a bottle. He felt the first squeeze of doubt, small at first, a ring around the chest that comes when experience has not yet fully replaced the textbook. Captain Hayes' presence kept that ring from tightening. The captain's hands on the yoke were a sermon in restraint, easing pressure as if he were coaxing a horse rather than riding an engine. Ethan breathed with the rhythm of that steadiness and kept his voice level as he called out headings and speeds. For a moment, he pictured the approaching weather as a complicated handshake he would learn to read. In row 27, Danielle's breath slowed into the even pattern of a practice nap. She did not appear to hear the first faint bump or the second, sharper one that chased it. She had learned over years that the rest of the cabin could not guess to trust a certain kind of silence. Her hands, folded, were the hands of a woman who could count a pulse in the dark. The girl in the window seat beside her whispered that she was drawing the plane to keep from worrying. Danielle, without opening her eyes, murmured that it would be the best drawing the sky had seen all night. The drink service paused as the aircraft shouldered into a more muscular layer of air. A ripple of polite laughter flickered and vanished when someone's ginger ale tipped onto a tray. The attendants apologized with a knowing smile that took responsibility without assigning blame. People settled deeper into their seat. A few bowed their heads in prayer, hands linked across the armrest, as if the shared touch could steady their nerves. The captain's voice returned, soft as a hand to the shoulder, reminding everyone that their comfort mattered and that small bumps were normal along the winter lanes. On the seat back screens, the map now showed the long arc toward the middle of the country, and the weather graphic bled wider, a bruise turning from yellow to red. A retired schoolteacher sighed and tucked a blanket closer around her shoulders. A businessman in shirt sleeves wrote a short email to his parents and signed it with the rare tenderness of a grown son who still feels like a boy when he hears sleigh bells in a store. If anyone looked toward the cockpit door, it was just a rectangle of brushed metal in the dim. Time slid like quiet water. The plane climbed a little higher, then held. The bumps returned, this time with a heavier fist. Overhead panels rattled and settled. Two attendants made eye contact across the galley and nodded the way professionals do when the conversation is wordless but complete. We have done this before, we will do it again. The boy who had loved the wiggle now gripped his mother's hand with both of his. The rosary clicked a little faster. A voice somewhere said, half joking, that this would be a story for the family table in New York. A deeper shudder rolled through the frame, a single hard knock that silenced the cabin. Coffee went sideways in the shine on the tray table. The attendant at row 10 braced and then smiled with an apology so deft it could have been choreography. Danielle's eyes opened, clear at once, as if her body had simply decided it was time. She looked down the aisle, measuring, and then, because the best habit is often mercy, offered her napkin to the woman across from her who had spilled cranberry juice on a sweater with white snowflakes stitched across the chest. The woman thanked her. Danielle nodded and returned her gaze to the middle distance where the aircraft was not so much a room as a promise. Another tremor. Not a dip, not yet, but a longer insistence that the air did not care about calendars or human schedules. From the curtain ahead came the muted exchanges of service continuing in first class. Gregory remarked, in a voice that carried, that this was why he preferred a smaller cabin. Linda put a hand on his sleeve, a request and a plea. He sipped his seltzer and glanced at the news crawl again, which had changed to a red banner. The phrase, hazardous conditions, nudged at the edges of the words he liked to use about himself. Prepared, savvy, in control. The lights blinked once as systems adjusted to a new command. In the cockpit, Ethan's checklist flowed cleanly, but there was a small, unwelcome tremor in his right hand. He tucked it against his thigh for a heartbeat, then resumed. He told himself he knew this air, even if he had never flown directly into the teeth of a December squall that had gathered 5 states worth of sky. The captain said something light and kind about a football game he had once watched in a snowstorm. Ethan smiled and, for a breath, felt the knot loosen. Then the plane lurched, a single downward shrug so sudden that a chorus of seatbelts chimed all at once against metal. A few cries rose and fell. Someone said, "It's okay," to no one in particular. The attendants in the galley steadied the coffee pot with both hands and pulled the cart securely against the wall. Danielle's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the armrests, then relaxed. Her eyes, now fully awake, moved to the forward bulkhead, the place where a person looks when she is listening for more than sound. The captain's baritone did not return. There was, instead, a pause that felt like a held breath. In first class, Gregory's mouth was already shaping a new remark about pilot competence, but the words did not come. A sliver of instinct moved through the plane, a shared animal understanding that something had changed in the air beyond the cabin lights. The boy with the drawing looked up from his crayons. The rosary stilled in the teacher's hands. The audiobook went quiet in a young man's ear as he slipped one bud out to listen. The turbulence slapped again, and this time the hush that followed was neither polite nor voluntary. Those closest to the front heard a sound they could not name, a gesture breaking, a breath caught. Somewhere, deep beneath the skin of the jet, a system pinged, not in alarm but in attention, the way a heartbeat does when it pauses to decide between one pace and another. Danielle rose a fraction of an inch from her seat and then sat back, reading the silence the way other people read the sky. She did not yet move to the aisle. There is a dignity in waiting until waiting is no longer the kindest option. Captain Hayes suddenly slumped in the cockpit, and Ethan, terrified, called for a flight attendant. The chime from the ceiling felt like a tap on the shoulder, gentle and inevitable. And then the cabin speakers carried a voice that was trying very hard to be steady. The first officer introduced himself in careful phrases, explained that the captain was unable to continue, and asked if anyone on board had military aviation experience to come forward. People exchanged looks the way neighbors do when the power goes out at dinner time. A woman reached for her husband's hand and squeezed it twice. A teenager pulled out his earbuds and pressed pause. The little boy with crayons lifted his drawing as if the plane itself might answer. Outside the windows, the night had thickened into a textured dark clouds layered like wool, and the air kept rearranging its weight under the wings. The jet's long body shrugged and resettled. The cart in the galley clicked into its locks and stayed there. A flight attendant moved down the aisle, eyes kind but alert, reminding those who had unbuckled to return belts to their laps. In first class, a glass chimed against a saucer. In economy, paper cups leaned in their rings. The old man with the rosary brought the beads to his lips for a heartbeat and then back to his fingers. People listened the way people do when they do not yet know if hope is required or merely polite. Gregory Stanton stood before anyone else, smoothed his jacket with the back of his hand, and pitched his voice for the space between his row and the next. He said he had spent hundreds of hours on private jets, that he knew procedures and could assist, that the intercom always sounded more dramatic than reality. He nodded toward the blue curtain as if he could see through fabric to the instrument panel. A flight attendant stepped in to respond with professional balm, thanking him for the concern and repeating the request for anyone with specific military experience. Gregory smiled the way a man smiles when he has decided to be patient with other people's rules. He added that in first class the stakes were higher, and that the airline would surely prefer a calm, familiar hand. The cabin carried that statement for a moment and then set it down, the way a church carries a cough and returns to the hymn. Danielle Carter opened her eyes. The girl at the window beside her folded the paper with the airplane drawing and tucked it into a backpack shaped like a blue whale. Danielle's breath was even, but now purposeful. She listened for a second call from the cockpit. It came, thinner this time, the first officer asking again, and the words serious medical emergency and category 5 storm, moving through the speakers like a cold wind under a door. Conversations shortened by half. Several people pulled out their phones to text in steady sentences that did not show worry, only information. Airborne, turbulence, might land late. The social feed of a college student lit with a streaming window, title bar, reading that a big Delta flight was in rough weather over the Great Lakes. He cleared his throat and, in a quieter voice than he usually used online, said he would keep people updated. Ethan Miller in the cockpit kept his eyes on the panel, the needles that trembled in their lanes, the green figures that told him what he wanted to believe, that systems were solid, that the airframe was fine, that he could hold this engine river of air, the way a ferryman holds a line against a winter current. The captain's head had fallen to one side. The sound the captain made was not a word. Ethan called for a flight attendant and felt the peculiar sensation of talking into more than one room at once. The cockpit, the cabin, the quiet inner room that every pilot has where he asks himself whether this is the night he becomes exactly what his training says he can be. The attendant answered on the interphone and then moved, quick and contained, toward the door. Danielle released her seatbelt. She stood with the grace of someone who had been taught to make standing look like staying still. A few eyes traveled up her jeans to her jacket, to her face, and then, measuring some mixture of youth and calm and ordinary, traveled away again. She thanked the man in the aisle seat across from her for tucking his knees as she passed. And he said, of course, in the tone Midwesterners use when they hold a door and pretend it is nothing. As she moved forward, she felt the pitch and rolled different, listened to the air by way of aluminum and rivets, felt how the gusts were teaching the jet what they wanted, felt how the jet was answering in the polite, stubborn language of wait and lift. Gregory saw her and, noting her clothes and her seat assignment and what he thought those meant, rearranged his face into concern and authority. He stepped into the aisle just enough to make himself a gate. He told her that the crew needed professionals right now. Danielle thanked him as if he had offered her a place in line and kept going. He said pleasantly at first that he had experience with aircraft systems. She nodded again and asked the flight attendant for the quickest route to the cockpit door. The attendant hesitated, caught between a company's hierarchy and a human moment, and asked for credentials. Danielle reached into her jacket for a leather wallet, worn smooth by time, opened it to a card that did not flaunt much, and then closed it again with the same small motion. The attendant's breath left in a soft oh. Training, more than relief. lifted her posture. She gestured forward. The spiral of weather slid a finger down the fuselage. Luggage rattled in a bin and then settled. The fasten seatbelt sign glowed brighter in people's minds than in the ceiling. Danielle reached the galley and met the eyes of the attendant who had just come from the cockpit. The attendant looked shaken, composed, shaken again. Danielle asked for 3 numbers: altitude, indicated airspeed, and crosswind component. The attendant repeated what she had heard in the headset. 38,000 feet, a speed in the high 400s. Winds sheared and gusting with a crossflow that changed faster than the person could bless herself. Danielle thanked her and took one more step. Linda, in first class, watched her husband watching Danielle. She recognized the set of his jaw, the way he preferred commentary to humility. She told him, very quietly, to let the crew do their work. He said, equally quietly, that he was trying to help. She reached for his hand and found that his fingers were cold. Outside, a network of lightning limned the clouds so that briefly the sky looked like paper held to a lamp. A boy in economy whispered a count to 10 and then started again, a private spell to steady the world. Danielle spoke with the first officer over the interphone. She kept her voice level and her questions specific. She did not say who she was. She asked for the kind of decisions he wanted to make this minute and the next. Did he have clearances in hand for descent, if necessary? What were the ice warnings showing? Had he set the transponder to the emergency code? Did he have the crew's medical kit open at his left knee? Ethan answered, grateful to be told what to say rather than how frightened to feel. He realized, more by the structure of her sentences than by any credential, that the woman on the other end had sat where he sat and had done so with lives depending on her tone. Gregory left his seat a second time, announced that he had 200 hours of experience as a passenger in luxury aircraft and that he knew the procedures. The words settled uneasily in the air. A man across the aisle frowned into his empty cup. A woman in a red cardigan told Gregory that the crew had asked for military experience, not membership rewards. The flight attendant at row 12 said, "Sir, please be seated for your safety," with the softness of a velvet rope. Gregory bristled and then complied, opening his laptop with the energy of a man choosing which story he would later tell about himself. Danielle bypassed judgment and gathered facts. She asked the attendants to have a portable oxygen bottle ready. She told them that if the captain could be stabilized in his seat, the most important medicine was to get the aircraft to an altitude and air where the body's stubborn miracles could resume their work. She asked for the defibrillator to be set near the door, not because she would use it without a full assessment, but because he might need it on the ground and then it would not be lost in the shuffle. Doctor. Angela Park stood from first class with a measured calm, introduced herself, and asked permission to assist. Danielle thanked her and said the cockpit would welcome her hands. The cabin shuddered with a longer wave, the kind that starts in the gut and blossoms behind the eyes. Trays rattled and then were silent. Somewhere toward the back, a baby gave a short, high cry and then stopped when someone who loved her pressed a cheek to her hair. The map on the screens showed the jet shouldering eastward into a bruise-colored band. The caption at the bottom called out lake effect snow as if it were a person at the door. The first officer came back on the intercom and asked again, more briefly now, and used the phrase combat aviation. In the row behind Danielle's now empty seat, a college student whispered to his camera that something serious was happening, but that the flight attendants were taking good care of everyone. Near the cockpit, Danielle encountered the last small wall between doubt and action. A junior attendant, cheeks pale but spine straight, lifted a hand to stop her, searching for a script that would satisfy both policy and conscience. Danielle met her eyes and, for a beat, allowed the young woman to see not only authority but responsibility. She said she would state her name, rank, and qualifications in the doorway within earshot of the first officer and would defer to the crew if asked to step back. The attendant moved aside with an expression that grew a decade older and a shade steadier in an instant. On the threshold, Danielle spoke so that only the cockpit could truly hear. She gave her name in full, said former United States Air Force, said flight hours counted not in pleasure but in practice, said primary platform F-22 Raptor, said training in extreme weather navigation and emergency descent profiles. Ethan inhaled the sound between surprise and relief. The captain slumped again, a wave moving through him that told its own terrible truth. Dr. Park slid past Danielle and placed 2 careful fingers where they could read the heart's handwriting. She spoke in calm syllables about airway, breathing, circulation, asked for the kit, and opened it with the neat competence of a woman who had spent years keeping skill and compassion in balance. From the doorway, Danielle began to outline a path no wider than a thread, and as strong as braided steel. She asked Ethan to confirm fuel state and center of gravity. She had him set the transponder to the international emergency code. She said that if they needed to descend, they would do so in a controlled profile that would protect the airframe and the passengers' hearts. She said that this was possible, that nothing she was asking would demand magic, only attention and practice. Ethan said he could do that. His hands on the yoke steady to the old song his instructors had taught, the one that goes aviate, navigate, communicate, said in that order because the sky prefers humility to panic. In first class, Gregory told the man across the aisle that the woman at the front could not possibly be who she said she was. He gestured toward Danielle's jeans, toward her quiet, toward the seed she had left in coach. He asked rhetorically if experts traveled light. The man across the aisle said that sometimes they did, and sometimes they liked to sleep, and sometimes that was how you knew they were experts. Linda watched her husband and felt awareness that had more to do with years than with weather. She did not argue. She let the quiet draw a circle around him and stood just outside it. The jet endured a fresh percussion from the storm. A drum roll played with the wrong sticks. The oxygen mask did not deploy. The attendants did not scream. The cabin did not lose its last reserve of grace. Instead, people did what people often do when reminded of their fragility. They make space for one another. A young man helped an elderly woman open a bottle of water. A mother tucked a blanket over a stranger's knees. The college student trending online stopped narrating for several minutes because he understood that the most honest thing he could do was witness rather than perform. Danielle stepped 1 foot inside the cockpit and kept the other in the galley, a bridge between 2 worlds. She said that she would not touch a switch without the first officer's consent. She asked to confirm the autopilot's current mode. She requested a check on pressurization. She never raised her voice. She carried authority as if it were a candle in the chapel, lighting faces without blinding them. Ethan found his breath matching her cadence, and the space between adrenaline and action narrowed to something he could stand inside. The aircraft jolted again, sharp and mean, the kind of jab that prompts confession. A wide, collective hush followed, the kind that happens when everyone imagines a different version of the same prayer. Danielle did not flinch. She said, mostly to Ethan but also to the airplane itself, that she had seen worse and that this, too, could be flown. The line fed back into the cabin through tone rather than words. Shoulders eased a fraction. A man with a gray mustache opened his knuckles from the armrest. She looked to the attendant beside her and said, with crisp courtesy, that she would now state her credentials for the record. The attendant nodded, one hand at her headset, the other steady on the doorframe. Danielle lifted her chin and spoke clearly so that the cockpit microphones and the nearest rows in first class would carry the sound down the aisle. She gave her full name again, her branch, the platform on which she had qualified, and the specific domains in which she had taught. She did not list medals. She did not sell herself. She placed facts in order and let them stand, sturdy as a line of fence posts in snow. The cabin went very quiet. Somewhere in the middle rows, someone said, "Oh," in a small, surprised voice, as if answering a question they had not realized they had asked. Dr. Park, eyes on the captain's face, called out a set of instructions that a flight attendant followed without asking for a second opinion. Ethan rebacked Danielle's requests with new steadiness. The storm pressed its palm against the windows and then, as if respecting the tone inside, eased a notch. Danielle Carter said she would help, if the crew wished, to guide the aircraft towards safer air and a runway that could accept a bird this size. She spoke as a colleague, not a savior. She asked Ethan if he wanted that help. The answer came from the place in him that had wanted this job since he was a boy, watching contrails, crisscross winter skies? Yes. Gregory burst out laughing. You must be kidding. A black woman in economy claiming she can fly a Boeing 747? The laughter cut across the cabin like a bright, brittle thing. And then the sound went thin as people tried to decide whether to pretend they had not heard it. The aircraft gave a long, low shiver, as if something far outside were dragging a fingertip along its skin. Lights along the aisle steadied. In the cockpit, the first officer kept his voice inside his chest and his hands on the yoke, repeating to himself the order that training had carved there. Fly the airplane first. He felt for the small anchor of routine and found it in checklists spoken softly enough to calm the air. The flight attendants, who knew how to pour gentleness into urgency, moved with their hands visible and their shoulders square. One carried the medical kit forward for the doctor who had identified herself. Another set a portable oxygen bottle by the cockpit door, and a third crouched to explain to an elderly couple that keeping belts fastened would help the pilots do their work. People breathed together in the unspoken pact of travel. Be kind, make space, wait for the next good thing to happen. Danielle Carter stood at the threshold between cabin and cockpit, a place where noise narrowed into purpose. She asked the first officer for the numbers again, not because she doubted him, but because Rachel studied skill. Altitude indicated airspeed, crosswinds, and gusts. He read them out with more confidence the second time. She asked for cabin pressure, for outside air temperature, for icing advisories. He checked, answered, and heard his own tone lift half a key. She did not reach for a switch. She did not lean past him. She allowed the cockpit to remain his, and in that allowing he felt himself return to it. Gregory Stanton, who disliked feeling irrelevant more than he disliked turbulence, rose a half-inch from his seat and then sat again because the aisle was already occupied by a flight attendant. He raised his voice just enough to carry 2 rows forward and 2 rows back and said that credentials could be faked and that Wikipedia could teach anyone how to talk like a pilot. The man across from him asked in a quiet voice whether he believed everything he read online. Someone farther back coughed into a sleeve and then apologized to no one in particular. The girl who had been drawing in economy slipped her picture of the airplane back out of her backpack and drew a thick, dark path through the sky above his wings. Beside her, a grandmother with a blue scarf closed her eyes and mouthed a prayer that had lived under her breath since childhood. The college student with the live stream kept his phone low and spoke in a steady whisper. He told the people watching that the crew was working, that the doctor had gone forward, that the woman who had stood up walked like a person who had spent time around engines. In the cockpit, Dr. Angela Park checked the captain's pulse, spoke quietly about breathing and rhythm, and guided a flight attendant through simple steps with the ease of someone who believed that instructions should be as measured as the actions they describe. The first officer glanced across, met Danielle's eyes for heartbeat, and found there the precise, ordinary courage of a person who knows she does not own the sky but has learned how to read it. She told him that their best medicine was thinner air and steadier wind, and that if he needed to descend, they would trade altitude for comfort without hurried hands or sudden promises. He said he wanted to keep control. She said yes, that was the right wanting. She asked whether he had set the emergency code on the transponder. He had. She asked whether he had declared an emergency with air traffic. He had not yet, and she said he could do so in the next breath, simply and without apology. He pressed the call button, spoke with the calm that professionalism lends to fear, and heard the controller answer with the warmth that professionalism offers in return. Vectors will be available, priority granted when requested, help standing by without drama. The jet wavered, then steadied. In economy, a flight attendant knelt to speak with a veteran in a ball cap decorated with wings, and he nodded and said that winter skies wear their roughness like a coat. You let them and you keep your feet. Danielle angled herself so that she could see both the panel and the aisle. She kept her voice easy as she described, for the first officer and for the cabin beyond the door, what a controlled emergency descent would look like if they needed it. A turn that was less like a fall and more like a spiral staircase. A descent rate chosen for the airplane and for the humans in it. Angles that respected structure and stomachs alike. She did not use jargon. She did not perform. She spoke so that understanding would be a handrail anyone could hold. Gregory said that if someone needed to speak for the passengers, he was willing. Linda touched his wrist and said that the crew already had speakers. He told her, with exasperation phrased as charm, that sometimes people needed reassurance from someone who understood risk. She looked at him, not unkindly, and asked whether he understood the kind of risk that requires silence. The weather outside bunched and flexed. The high, metallic rattle of the overhead bins returned, then softened like hail turning back into rain. A flight attendant paused at the bulkhead and made eye contact with Danielle. Ready when you are, that looked sad, and also, thank you for making ready feel like routine. The first officer requested a small change in heading to ease the worst of the crosswinds, and air traffic granted it with a string of words that felt like a song with only one note. All reassurance and tempo. Danielle asked the first officer to talk through his priorities, not as a test, but as a way to align two minds. He said, fly, navigate, communicate. He said, keep the captain stable, keep the cabin composed, aim for smoother air and the runway with length and foam and lights all the way to the horizon. She said, that was exactly right. She asked if he preferred she remain on the threshold to guide or step into the left seat. He hesitated only long enough to be honest, and then said he wanted to keep flying, with her voice riding beside his hands. She said yes. In the rows just behind first class, conversations took on the pitched rhythm of people practicing disagreement without escalation. A woman said she trusted the woman at the door because she sounded like people sound when they have seen storms before. A man said storms make people sound confident until they do not. A teenager rode a bracelet between his fingers and said he liked the way the woman didn't shout. A mother asked her daughter to put away the video because recording other people when they are frightened might be the opposite of kind. The turbulence arrived in a new shape. A quick, curt drop that emptied stomachs and then jammed them back into spines. A few people cried out. Then came the sound that trumps fear in a good cabin. The sound of strangers telling each other they will be all right. The first officer rode the dip as if it were a wave, not a betrayal. His breath caught and then leveled. Danielle, in a tone meant for him and also meant for the airplane, said that the jet was built for this, and that skill was simply a way to be polite to physics. She began, calmly, to recite an emergency profile for a loss of pressurization at cruise. Not because that was happening, but because the memory of it steadied the rhythm of action. Immediate oxygen, orderly descent toward 10,000 feet if required, descent angles that respect structure, communications clean and concise, no heroics where patience would do. The first officer answered with the cadence of a man returning to the language that shaped him. Doctor, Park, without lifting her eyes from the captain, murmured that this was good for the cabin too. People trust the melody of competence, even if they cannot parse the words. Gregory, faced with a tide that would not part for him, tried a different tack. He spoke directly to a flight attendant and said that the airline would bear legal responsibility if unauthorized persons were allowed into the cockpit. The attendant nodded with courtesy and said that the person at the door had been identified and that the crew's decisions would reflect policy and safety together. He asked whether she understood that first-class passengers had expectations. She said that every soul on board had exactly the same expectation tonight, to arrive alive. The map on the screens showed the airplane's icon nudging eastward along a line that bent like a bow. Graphics flared a deeper red over the Great Lakes. In a row near the rear galley, a man with a gray mustache explained to his seatmate what lake effect snow meant, tracing squiggles with his finger on the armrest, making weather into a story you could touch. The seatmate nodded and said that sometimes the best thing about a story is the way it ends. The aircraft shouldered into a harder wall of air. A ripple passed front to back as if the plane were a bell struck once. In the cockpit, the first officer felt his right hand quiver and then obey. He kept his voice level and asked for the new wind data. Danielle answered and offered a small adjustment that he took, not as an order but as a gift. She reminded him to watch vertical speed not as a number to chase but as a mood to respect. He found the mood and kept it there. At the doorway, a flight attendant lifted a hand. She needed to ask a question on behalf of passengers who could not stop asking her. Would the masks drop? Danielle said They would if they needed to, and that if they did, the most important thing was to put one on your own face and breathe normally, so your body could remember what it already knew about air. The attendant repeated it into the cabin, and people nodded, as though they had rehearsed this moment once in a friendlier room. Outside, lightning stitched a quick seam along a hem of cloud. The wing lights flashed, and the jet tilted through an angle that felt to the uninitiated like a decision. The first officer's hands worked in small, careful arcs. Danielle spoke in a low, steady stream about trim and balance and the way to think about lift when the air keeps changing its mind. He listened, and under the instruction he heard encouragement. Not flattery, not comfort, but the rare gift of being told the truth by someone who believes you can stand to hear it. In first class, Linda watched her husband watch the woman at the door. She saw something loosen in his face, not surrender exactly, but the beginning of it. He had always liked certainty best when it wore his clothes. He was not sure what to do with certainty when it wore denim. She touched the back of his hand with her fingertips and left them there lightly, the way one does with restless animals. The jet dropped fast enough to lift a few stomachs toward throats, then steadied again with a long exhale of metal and fabric. Cups rattled, a suitcase thunked inside a bin and then quieted. A child sobbed once and then soothed by a soft humming. Hiccuped himself back to calm. The first officer felt the old equation snap back into place. This much pitch, this much power, this much patience. Danielle said, in the same tone one uses to talk someone through a narrow driveway, that he was doing fine, that the airplane liked the touch he was using, that kinder hands fly better in winter. He nodded, a small motion that felt like a vow. For a heartbeat, a strange calm filled the cockpit, a calm that belongs only to people who are doing a hard thing well. Then the storm cuffed the tail and the nose in the same breath, a crosswise punch that would have made a lesser pilot chase the wrong correction. He started to overcompensate. Danielle's voice, firm and warm, set a boundary he could lean against. She told him to breathe, to bring the wings back level, to trust the instruments, to keep the descent shallow enough to protect both airplane and hearts. He did, and in that doing, something in him clicked into place that would never again shake loose. From the doorway, with the cabin listening without meaning to, Danielle said that she had landed in worse weather than this. She said it not as a boast, but as a promise. Trust me. For a long second, no one spoke. The plane held its line as if honoring the sentence. And then, from the first row behind the curtain, a voice rose sharp and certain, tearing the quiet like cloth. Get her out of the cockpit right now. This is suicide. The shout from the first row behind the curtain sliced the air and then frayed at the edges as people looked for a way to unhear it. A flight attendant lifted a hand with quiet authority and, without scolding, guided the speaker back into his seat with a phrase that sounded like a blessing disguised as a rule. Danielle did not turn. She kept her shoulders square to the cockpit and spoke to the first officer in a tone that could steady blood pressure. She asked for the most recent winds aloft, for the icing notes, for cabin altitude, for any amber lights that had flickered where green should be. He read out everything cleanly. She let a breath move through her, the small kind of breath that makes room for the next correct action. She asked him to open the emergency frequency. She said the numbers the way a person recites a prayer that has saved lives before, 121.5. He glanced at her as if to confirm that she truly meant it. The geography of his training included commercial towers and approach controls and center controllers with calm voices. It did not often call for the old white net where military and civilian meet in the middle of the sky. He reached and turned the dial, and the frequency rose in his headset like a lake surfacing through ice. He keyed the mic and spoke with clear formality. Commercial jet, medical incapacitation of the captain, severe winter weather, request for assistance, and identification support. There was a beat like a held chord. When the reply came, it arrived not as a question, but as a recognition that bent the air into a different shape. The voice said her name before rank, as if friendship had outrun order. Hawk, is that really you? We lost you on peripheral tracking 20 minutes ago. Say position, say intent, say souls on board. Ethan looked at her again, not to ask if this was happening, but to confirm that this was hers to answer. Danielle kept her gaze on the panel so that responsibility would know where to sit. She gave their approximate latitude and longitude from the instruments, the planned routing, the updated heading, the numbers that matter when you are accountable to more than your own breath. She said they carried more than 300 souls. She said their intent was to stabilize the captain as much as possible, maintain control in severe turbulence, and seek the nearest runway capable of receiving a large, heavy bird in winter distress. The voice identified itself as Colonel David Rodriguez, Andrews Air Force Base, call sign trimmed down to the lean vowels of practice. The change in his tone could be heard without headset. The way a professional speaks when he realizes the person on the other end speaks his language at a native level. He said he had eyes on the storm's movement, and that what it was doing above the Great Lakes had begun to break patterns in their models. He asked if she wanted the Pentagon looped in. Ethan had never in his life wanted anything less or more than to hear exactly this kind of help arriving. In first class, conversation faltered. Linda, who had once worked the overnight desk at a hospital in Wisconsin and knew the sound of triage when she heard it, wiped a thumbprint from the rim of her glass, as if polishing a small mirror back to clarity. Gregory considered the word souls and found he did not like it because it treated his seat in the last row of economy as equal weights on a scale. He asked a flight attendant, in a hushed voice calibrated to sound confidential rather than controlling, whether the airline understood its liability if a civilian were allowed to take charge. The attendant nodded as if she were agreeing with the weather and said that the person at the door had been identified and that the only liability with wait tonight would be failure to let expertise work. In the cockpit, Dr. Angela Park spoke in small, precise sentences that could fit between the aircraft's motions. She asked for a new blood pressure reading with a cuff, and the attendant at her elbow moved with a feel calm that good training gives. The readings came back like footsteps down a long hallway. Doctor, Park considered them, addressed airway and breathing as gently as a hymn, and said that if the air in the cabin could be made kinder by height or by trajectory, the captain's body might take advantage of the relief. She did not press. She gave information as a gift that could be accepted without embarrassment. Colonel Rodriguez's voice returned, brisk now, the way briskness feels when it is made of care rather than impatience. He said he was patching in a secure line. And then another voice entered the headsets with the weight of someone who signs orders and lives with their names. This is General Patricia Collins, Air Operations Command. Her voice was low and even the tone of a person whose math goes all the way out to consequence. She used Danielle's call sign like a salutation at a reunion. Danielle Carter, the Pentagon confirms. You have priority across the northeastern corridor. Say your immediate needs. Ethan was not a man inclined to hero worship, but there are moments when new facts arrive and reshape the furniture in the room. He looked at Danielle without turning his head, as if moving his eyes might drop something valuable. He had thought a helpful passenger had appeared, bearing credibility like a toolbox. Now he understood that he had been joined by someone whose toolbox contained, among other items, the habit of being obeyed by a very large portion of the United States government. He felt relief not as surrender, but as the chance to do his job at the right elevation. Danielle asked for real-time spacing on storm cells ahead, for suggested headings that would allow them to thread weaker seams, for confirmation that Dover and McGuire-Dix Lakehurst were preparing for a heavy arrival on winter pavement. She asked for a weather picture up the eastern seaboard because if they decided to go farther, she wanted the map in her head to match the map on the ground. The general gave her what she asked and promised what could be promised. Rodriguez leaned back into the frequency with the contained enthusiasm of a man who loves watching skill meet grace in a tight corner. He said they had eyes from 13 bases, and that if she wanted, they would clear every crossing route and hold patterns like beads on a string, one after another, until she needed them. News travels around a cabin the way warm air does in an old farmhouse, by vents and by chance, and by people leaning into doorways to say a sentence and then moving on. Someone in row 9 whispered that the woman at the door had a call sign, and someone in row 15 whispered that the voices had said Pentagon out loud, and someone in row 20 said their cousin in the Air Force once told them that call signs are not nicknames. They are stories that have already been paid for. The college student kept his phone low and whispered to his feet that help had arrived on a frequency with a name that sounded like a street lamp number. He did not shout. He did not perform. He recorded what steadiness looks like. Danielle asked Ethan to bring up the terrain and weather overlays and to consider a single, small change in heading to let a faster band slide under their wing instead of across it. He did so, and the jet responded with the cooperative sigh of a machine relieved to be asked the right question. She listened to the body of the plane for confirmation and heard it. The slider rattle, the shift from angry to insistent, the way the yaw settled like a bird bringing one wing to tuck. She acknowledged the change with a quiet good. The word did not praise. It simply marked the place on the map where they now stood. General Collins asked if she wished to declare a formal emergency beyond what the first officer had already announced. Danielle said yes, which was not surrender but clarity. The general's reply came with the quiet fireworks of airspace reassigning itself. You could almost hear other pilots receiving orders to hold, to climb, to make room for a new priority born in a storm. A controller from the civilian side joined to say that approach vectors would be clear like a parade route and that foam, ambulances, and lights would be waiting like a city holding its breath for a returning ship. Gregory said to no one and to everyone that this was all overly dramatic, that nobody cleared airspace like that for anything except theater, that if you wanted to impress a crowd, you talked to generals. A man in a wool cap said that if a general was talking, he would like to listen. Linda's face changed in the way a face changes when it finally tells the truth to itself. She reached into the seat pocket and pulled out a safety card as if it were new literature. She read it with attention instead of habit, and then she folded it carefully and put it back as if making a promise. A flight attendant leaned into the bulkhead and, with the elegance that comes from grace under repetition, told the rows nearest first class that they would be hearing some professional voices on the radio, and that the important thing for them to do was to stay seated, to breathe, and to let composure be contagious. People nodded. One man mouthed, "Thank you." The boy with the crayons traced his airplane's wings again, but this time he drew them slightly angled, as if they were catching a different current. Rodriguez returned with what Ethan could only call affection disguised as briefing. He recited a fragment of a file that sounded like legend tucked into fact. Operations flown, airframes shepherded home by voice alone, sand turned into night by engines, a list of things that had ended well because of choices made in weather no one meant to be in. He used the name Hawk in the middle of sentences, the way some people use the word please. Ethan understood that this was not flattery but orientation. Everyone on the frequency would now act in the way that suits expertise when it arrives. Dr. Park called out for a temperature check. The reading was a little better. She relaxed one muscle in her jaw and said she would continue to monitor closely. She gave the captain's shoulder a human touch that said, "Stay with me." She did not ask the airplane to do anything. She asked the body in front of her to remember itself. Danielle described, for Ethan and for the invisible circle of listeners, the profile she wanted if they had to descend through the worst of it. She spoke about vertical speed as a living thing you treat with respect. She spoke about pitch and power, the way good teachers talk about hands on a violin. She spoke about the way to imagine the storm not as a wall but as a city with alleys where wind runs slow. She did not romanticize, she did not hurry. She fitted words to reality until reality felt somewhat more navigable. The jet bucked hard once, a mean jab just off center line, and the string of ceiling panels clicked with a fuss that sounded like a line of teacups catching breath. Ethan rode it with a correction that was quicker than thought and then undid the extra motion he had given in reflex. Danielle's voice was there with a new heading, which asked less of the crosswind without insulting the lift. He nodded and felt the nod echo down his spine like a rung on a ladder taken without looking. A controller from the civilian side chimed in again to say that Dover reported active plowing with foam trucks standing by, that McGuire-Dix Lakehurst had cleared equipment for a long, clean approach, and that emergency medical teams would stage on both ends and the midfield. The words did not carry drama. They carried the comfort of a town gathering blankets and soup when a blizzard keeps neighbors from getting home. Between first class and the door, Gregory half stood and then folded back down as the steward's hand hovered, not touching but persuading. He said, in a lower voice, that all of this might be a very expensive lesson for the airline when the press got a hold of it. The steward said that he would rather the press had a story of professionalism than a silence no one could fill. He asked if Gregory would like some water. Gregory said no in the tone one uses to refuse a peace offering. Danielle took in the panel like a map of a peninsula she had sailed before. She asked Ethan to set a second radio to monitor the primary center while keeping the emergency net alive. She asked for a confirmation of fuel distribution to be sure their balance would behave through a descent if they committed. She asked for a review of center of gravity and made a mental note to keep the changes even slower than her habit would prefer. He gave her everything and watched his own fear thin like breath on glass. On social media, which had a way of hearing news it was not yet authorized to know, a hashtag began to seed itself in cautious sentences. People posted that they were on a flight where a woman in coach stood up and spoke like the sky belonged to her. They posted that a doctor had gone forward. They posted that a voice named Rodriguez kept saying hawk with pleasure. They did not panic in their posts. They wrote the way people write when they hope for a story they can retell at a table with candles in the middle. General Collins spoke again. Her words arrived like the click of a light coming on in the hallway leading to the runway. You have priority across the northeast corridor, Hawk. We are moving traffic for you. Confirm your plan. Danielle answered in the simple, bordered language of intent. She said they would continue to stabilize the captain, that they would vector toward the safest air identified by the controllers, and that they would prepare for an approach into McGuire-Dix Lakehurst. Unless she requested Dover based on the latest runway condition reports. She said she would command the aircraft only if requested to sit, that the first officer's hands were good, and that her role was coaching and decision tree. Ethan looked down at his own hands and saw that they were, in fact, steady. He felt older in a way that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with practicing courage in the exact size of moment one is given. He thanked her without saying thank you. She acknowledged without saying you are welcome. The storm pressed another palm against the fuselage and then let it go. There was a strange, bright quiet in the cockpit, like the hush after a choir ends, a long note, and the air holds the shape of the music for a breath. Danielle looked at the flight attendant by the door and said that she would inform the cabin soon. The attendant nodded and, with a practiced smile that somehow conveyed sincerity, stepped back to the interphone to prepare. Rodriguez's voice came one more time with the kind of joy that can exist in emergency if you believe strongly in craft. He said that for what it was worth, he was very glad the sky had arranged to cross them again. He said his team would be with them every inch until tires met ground, and another team after that, and another if needed. The general added that the president had been briefed not for drama but because responsibility has a chain, and tonight it ran through this aisle, this cockpit, this woman who stood like a hinge between rooms. In first class, a woman in a red cardigan closed her eyes and let her shoulders drop, as if a weight she did not know she carried had just been lifted off and set gently on the floor. The man in the wool cap said quietly that this was going to make a fine story for grandchildren, and then amended that it would make an even finer silence, the kind of silence that sits at the end of a day and feels like mercy. Danielle glanced one last time at the panel, at Ethan's hands, at Doctor. Parks focused at the small details that tell you whether a story is ready to turn. She drew a breath that did not ask permission. Then she spoke into the cockpit, into the headset that carried her voice across states, and into the cabin where strangers had become a congregation. Prepare, we are about to do something that has never been attempted with a Boeing 747. What done. The first turn felt like the beginning of a long, deliberate dance, the nose easing a few degrees while the wings emitted a measure of bank. Danielle stood with one foot still in the galley and the other just inside the cockpit, her voice steady as a metronome while Ethan trimmed, checked, and trimmed again. He matched her cadence, called out power settings, and watched vertical speed the way a careful driver watches the edge of winter roads. The aircraft answered their touch with a grudging cooperation, as if surprised to record it, not commanded. Wind leaned against aluminum in long muscular pushes that arrived out of rhythm and then, surprisingly, began to take a rhythm from the crew. The first officer asked for a small reduction in thrust to keep the descent gentle on the bodies behind the curtain. Danielle agreed and added a breath of rudder to ease the yaw. Doctor, Angela Park kept her attention on the captain's face, her fingertips reading pulse like braille, while a flight attendant opened a small bottle of water and set it near her elbow, cap loose for one-handed use. In the cabin, attendants moved down the aisles with the reassuring choreography of people who know that eye contact can be as medicinal as oxygen. The big jet tilted further. A chorus of armrest grips tightened and then, little by little, released. Danielle described the spiral in simple language that did not require a license to understand. Think of a wide staircase, she told Ethan, and we are stepping down one careful step at a time. Gradual bank, steady pitch, vertical speed like a pendulum that you do not let swing too wide. He repeated the image aloud, and the repetition steadied his hands. He eased the nose a touch and watched the rate of descent settle into a number that felt like a well-chosen compromise between structure and stomach. Snow battered the windows in grainy bursts. Lightning stitched brief seams inside far clouds, revealing layers like folds in heavy curtains. The aircraft slid along a corridor of air that only became visible by the way it treated the plane. A woman in economy, her hair pinned with a barrette shaped like a holly leaf, pressed her palms together and whispered a quiet prayer for strangers and professionals. A teenager closed his live stream and set the phone face down on the tray table, as if silence were the kindest thing the internet could hear. Rodriguez checked back over the emergency frequency with the bright brevity of a person whose help is constant whether heard or not. He gave wind reports across a string of waypoints, offered a heading that would spare them a rude sheer 2 minutes ahead, and let the sentence end on the word copy, which can sound like comfort when spoken in a certain tone. General Collins added a brief confirmation that corridors had been cleared as requested and that medical teams were staging in layers, with ambulances, with blankets, with the practical mercies that meet a winter night. Ethan flowed from checklist to sensation and back again. He felt the tail want to wag under a crosswind that insisted and then, with the barest touch, convinced it to behave. He kept one eye on the vertical speed and another on the nose attitude, refusing the temptation to chase either. Danielle's voice was there whenever the rhythm threatened to wobble, a patient hand on the back that says, this way, this way. She asked for a fuel balance check and for a small transfer to keep their center of gravity within the friendliest range. He made the adjustment and felt the airplane say, thank you, in the long, slow language of steadier roll. In first class, a flight attendant offered water in plastic cups with a napkin slid under each one as if set on an invisible saucer. Linda accepted hers with a soft thank you and watched the men around her reconsider what they believed about authority. Gregory tapped at a phone screen and put it down again, picked it up, put it down, as if trying to choose the story he would tell himself later. He flinched at a big bump and smoothed his jacket with both hands. A man ironing a wrinkle in the world that would not lie flat. The spiral grew more confident. The bank held, the nose stayed patient. The numbers obeyed a tempo rather than a demand. Danielle described to Ethan how to keep the wings within a range that respected the airplane's winter temperament. She suggested a breath more power to stop the descent from getting overeager. He nudged the throttles forward and watched the vertical speed slow, not to a halt but to a civilized stroll. The airplane answered as if it had been waiting to be spoken to in its first language. Attendants walked the aisle, checking on elderly knees and young nerves. One offered an extra blanket to a man in a wool cap. Another rescued a loose bin with a firm twist. The smell of brewed coffee drifted from the galley. Not served but ready. A promise that ordinary life would resume. A child whispered that the plane was dancing. Her mother said that sometimes dancing is how you pass through a storm. Outside, the storm did not soften, but it learned their pattern. Wind tried blunt force. The crew replied with geometry. Gus insisted. The crew offered patience. When a sharp pocket of downdraft grabbed the airframe, Ethan let the nose dip only the amount the profile allowed and then brought it back with the quiet authority of someone who had decided to be the adult in the room. Danielle told him he was doing it right and kept a picture of the staircase in their shared sentence. One more step. Another. Keep the banister under your palm. The captain stirred and then settled again, the kind of motion that gives the doctor primary information, without requiring instruments. Dr. Park adjusted an oxygen mask near his face and spoke to him the way clinicians do when the body hears before the mind returns. "Stay here," she told him. "Stay with us." A flight attendant checked the AED only by touch, her fingers confirming the shape of readiness through the case without the show of unzipping it. The spiral reached the place where trust is more useful than fear. The big jet threaded a quieter seam and, for a handful of breaths, the cabin felt the difference. Several people leaned back from armrests at the same time and then looked at one another, surprised into a small laugh that did not travel far but did some good where it landed. A retired schoolteacher exhaled and opened her eyes and discovered the map channel again. The little airplane on the screen no longer wore a storm as a hat, but as a scarf pulled lower on the neck. Rodriguez caught a modest heading change to dodge a stubborn knot of wind. Ethan took it and found not relief, exactly, but permission to keep believing in the staircase. Danielle checked pressurization and cabin altitude once more, a ritual that says we do not take comfort for granted. She asked for the newest ice reports from ahead and listened to a list of numbers read with a clarity that civilians rarely hear unless they happen to be on a night like this one. She requested runway condition updates as they became available and asked that foam crews be briefed on a long rollout if braking action proved low. The aircraft rocked hard to starboard, a slap that tried to make panic look like common sense. Ethan's hands made a small mistake and a smaller correction. Danielle countered, with reminders arranged like stepping stones, wings, then nose, then power, breath, then instrument, then horizon. He obeyed the order, not because he had to, but because it felt better than improvisation. The jet returned to its shape. The cabin, which had begun to hold its breath, let it out. In the rear galley, an attendant leaned against the service door and looked at a colleague with a kind of smile that is also a prayer. They had done winter before. They would do winter again. They would do this night too. A man near the lavatory whispered to his neighbor that he had flown through a thunderstorm over Kansas once and that this felt different. The neighbor said it felt more deliberate, like someone was walking them down a hallway instead of shoving them down a chute. Ethan asked for a new power setting and got it right on the first guess. He avoided chasing the vertical speed and held it instead, almost like holding the hand of a nervous dog. Danielle complimented the touch by describing what would happen if he became greedy for smoothness. Extra pitch would lead to extra drag, which would lead to the wrong kind of sink. He accepted the gentle correction without shame. The instruments returned a small, private praise in the form of steadier needles. Lightning fluttered again, then died out like a thought that decided not to become a sentence. The storm still raged, but the rages passed through steel and fabric and found fewer edges to bite. Rodriguez sent another forecast slice. Collins followed with a brief reassurance that emergency services were staging not only at the selected base, but at alternates in case their plan changed. The general did not waste words. She let her confidence do its work. The controllers on the civilian side added a string of clearances that formed an elegant curve toward safety. Gregory, thwarted by the serenity of competence, tried to reclaim a shape for himself by speaking to the man across the aisle about market risk and exposure. The words sounded like a radio tuned to the wrong game. Linda placed a cup of water in his hand and told him, just above a whisper, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is be quiet while other people do difficult work. He stared at the water, then drank, because doing nothing felt too much like doing something. The cabin absorbed the new tempo. People checked on one another with small looks and then looked away to give privacy the respect it loves. The attendant near row 14 tucked a blanket around a pair of shoulders and moved on without asking for thanks. A boy with sleepy eyes asked his mother if the pilot lady would get a medal. His mother said that the only medals that matter are the people who get home. The spiral began to shallow. Ethan eased bank and watched the vertical speed diminish, keeping the descent within numbers that would not startle an already rattled heart. Danielle's voice shifted from teacher to teammate, keeping the words coming, fewer now, more precise. She asked for a tiny nudge of power to arrest the last eager bite of sink. He gave it, and the needle floated into the middle of its little window as if discovering where it was always meant to sit. For a measure of time that felt longer than it was, the aircraft rode a laminar ribbon as smooth as polished pewwood. People registered the smoothness, the way a person registers the absence of pain, with gratitude that does not require applause. Doctor. Park adjusted the captain's position and noted a reading that eased the line between her brows. Just a little. She asked for a status update in the cockpit and received one that sounded like a report after a reasonable day. Ethan could see, now, the shape of their approach as a possibility rather than a wish. He checked instruments in the old, correct order and found each one giving him an answer that matched the others. Danielle asked him to set the radios for the base they were favoring and to keep the emergency frequency open in his other ear. He did both and repeated back what would become their plan if no better plan announced itself. She said, yes, not go, not hurry, yes. The storm, perhaps offended by their calm, threw one last elbow into the fuselage. The airplane swayed, then found its line. No gasps this time, only a small rustle, as when a congregation shifts on its feet before the final hymn. The attendants checked bells with their eyes and gave thumb and forefinger signs to one another, a sign language that mostly means, we are still here, we're still us. Rodriguez's voice came through strong and clear, the sound of a man whose night had narrowed to a single bright thread. He confirmed the corridor ahead, described crosswinds peaking and then easing, and promised another update inside 30 heartbeats. General Collins followed with a plain statement of institutional promise, the kind that keeps its jacket buttoned. Crews are ready, lights are lit, doors are open. Ethan's mouth was dry, and he noticed it only because dryness no longer interfered with skill. He swallowed and asked Danielle to confirm the final small change she wanted to keep the last part of the spiral elegant. She confirmed it with 2 words and a tone that carried more mercy than any longer sentence could. He made the change. The airplane blessed them with the wordless good of obedience. For a quiet moment, the cabin felt the hum of engines as ordinary again, the way sea feels like sea when a storm steps a few yards away. A boy stared at the ceiling and then dropped his eyes and smiled, an involuntary smile that said his body understood safety before his mind dared. A grandmother patted her purse where Rosary lived and told herself she would light a candle at the earliest church she found. The radio crackled, bright and close, like a match struck in a dark room. The voice that filled the cockpit and, through the attendant's announcement, the cabin was brisk without alarm, official without frost, and tinged with the intimate relief of people who have prepared well, meeting people who have done the same. Hawk, the entire northeast airspace has been cleared. McGuire Dix Lakehurst is ready to receive you, but we are detecting unusually thick ice on the runway. 猴子, the message about unusual ice settled over the cockpit like a final exam placed on a desk, not meant to frighten, only to measure. Danielle nodded once, as if someone had asked whether she still intended to keep her promise. She asked for the freshest braking action report and a read on surface temperatures along the center line. The controller answered in steady syllables, each one a small square of information laid into place. Ethan repeated them back and felt the repetition build the floor under his feet. Danielle spoke softly to the airplane itself, a habit more than a belief, and then outlined the plan in a voice shaped for the first officer and the cabin alike. A long, shallow approach, a soft touchdown, reverse thrust early but modest, spoilers up with courtesy, no heroics, no rush, let distance be the friend it was born to be in winter. Down the aisle, attendants confirmed belts and tray tables by sight, hands hovering in that halfway posture that says, I am near if you need me, and I will not be in your way if you do not. A murmured prayer threaded through row 17, then fell quiet, as if the words had been placed on a mantle for safekeeping. In first class, Linda's fingers found the edge of the armrest and smoothed it the way a person calms a horse. Gregory stared at the ice cubes in his plastic cup and listened to the pitch of the engines, the way a man listens for his own name from another room. The bays rose to meet them as a necklace of lights lengthening out of the dark. Plows idled like patient beasts at the edges, foam trucks ranked in bright lines, ambulances waiting with the humility of machines that hope not to be needed. Danielle asked for one last wind check and a reminder to the ground teams that their rollout might take longer than a story likes to tell, but exactly as long as safety requires. Rodriguez confirmed, his voice carrying the compact joy of a craftsman watching other craftsmen at work. General Collins added a single word, copy, and somehow the syllable carried the strength of a salute. Ethan brought the nose with him as if coaxing a child from a high shelf. He set power by feel and by number. Numbers turn into words because words come to mind on nights like this. Flaps moved to the marks they were meant to live at. Gear came down with a soft, homely thump that turns a promise into an intention. The needles on the panel formed a small chorus in tune. Glide slope centered, localizer true, airspeed in the sliver of grace between eager and late. Danielle watched his hands and the horizon at once, her voice a rail at his hip. She reminded him to imagine the tires kissing the runway like a guest stepping onto a polished floor in stockinged feet. The storm was not done arguing, but its arguments had grown less persuasive at this height. Snow hissed against the windscreen in veils. The runway lights, haloed in ice, made a lane of tenderness through the cold. Danielle asked for arms and spoilers armed, then for a breath of power to keep the sink from becoming greed. He gave it, and the race smoothed like a wrinkle worked flat by a palm. Doctor, Park confirmed a steadying sign on the captain and told him, in a quiet voice, that they were almost home to help. They crossed the threshold a breath high and held it there with a patience that felt like a prayer made of muscle. The main gear met the ice with a touch that was less a landing than an agreement. The airplane settled into its weight without complaint. Danielle called for reverse thrust, and Ethan unspooled it in a careful measure, not a grab. Spoilers rose, laying the wings down into their honest drag. The first subtle slide came. The eyes, under rubber, asking whether confidence might be foolish. Danielle answered with a soft correction a parent uses when a child tests the edge of a rule. The nose stayed polite. The slide stopped pretending to be a plan. Reverse stayed in the green. Brakes waited. Distance did the work. The aircraft, which had fought through a sky that did not wish to be shared, now let itself be accompanied by the ground's steady insistence. Lights strobed along the edges like ushers pointing the way down long aisle. In the cabin, silence gathered, not the empty kind, but the kind with shoulders and hands, a silence in which people promised themselves to be better at something nameless and necessary if given the chance to keep breathing. They slowed more. A suitcase in the bin sighed back against a bulkhead, as if relieved to see its journey find the floor. The nose wheel traced a clean line on winter glass. Reverse feathered in and then rested. At last, the big machine came to a dignified stop. Not triumphant, simply complete. For a beat, no one moved. Then humans did what humans have done ever since. Relief learned to make sound. Applause began, soft and incredulous, then widened until it was a weather of its own. Some people laughed. The laugh you hear when someone puts down a heavy thing and shakes out their hands. A flight attendant's eyes shone, and she pressed her lips together in the professional trick that keeps tears in their places. Ethan covered the thrust levers with his palm and dared to look at Danielle. Thank you did not seem like an adequate currency for what had just passed between them. She nodded without heroics and asked him to taxi when cleared, slow as old music. He read back the instructions to ground control, the words almost tender in his mouth. She saved us all, he whispered, not to Danielle and not to himself, but to a place in the air that holds vows. Emergency crews approached, disciplined and slow, as if not to spook a wild thing that had finally come to a hand. The door opened to winter and flashing lights and the gentle tyranny of checklists that live on the ground. Doctor. Park yielded the cockpit to medics with the unspoken handshake of colleagues who respect one another's training. The captain was transferred with care that looked like choreography. On the jetway, blankets waited like small roofs. On the tarmac, boots made neat prints in snow that had seen a great deal tonight and would remember it in the morning. In the aisle, strangers found themselves touching shoulders and then stepped back with awkward smiles that said, "Pardon and thank you, and I am still here." An attendant unlatched a galley cart and, by reflex older than policy, set out small cups and water, because offering a drink is one of the ways Americans tell one another we are not alone. A child lifted both arms the way children do when they want to be carried, and then laughed at herself for asking, because her legs were eager to run down a jetway into the arms of waiting family. Gregory Stanton rose with a look like a man discovering a mirror that sees through skin. He moved forward, careful with his voice as if his words might slip on ice. He asked to speak to Danielle. Security, in that quiet, firm way that makes gratitude feel like a rule, stepped between him and the cockpit. The gesture was not punitive. It was protective of a boundary that had been hard-won this night. Gregory lowered his eyes and stepped back. His wife, who had said little and seen much, thanked the nearest attendant by name because she had read the pin on the lapel, and names are a way of coming back to earth. Phones found signals. Messages leapt from palm to palm and then out into the wide, bright habitat of social media. The hashtags that had been seated in fear bloomed now in relief. Declarations of gratitude, small videos of quiet crews doing brave work, still images of runway lights under a veil of ice. No one needed to be told to be kind. The tone took care of itself. People online asked people on board if everyone was alright and received answers that sounded like the exhale of a community after a long collective breath. A ground manager, cheeks chapped and eyes gentle, stepped into the cabin and spoke with the plain dignity of someone who likes his job most on the days when it proves itself worthy. He offered thanks on behalf of the base and the path through forms and follow-ups as simple as duty would allow. He suggested that those requiring assistance remain seated and that those eager to move could do so when guided. His words landed and stayed where they were set, like warm plates on a cold table. Danielle stood at last, and the cabin seemed to lean toward her without moving. She did not bow. She did not speechify. She said that the first officer had flown the airplane well and that the crew had taken care of their people, and that this is what they were all supposed to do when they signed up to be responsible for strangers. She thanked Dr. Park for hands that spoke fluently with urgency and kindness at once. She asked the attendants to take a second to breathe before taking the next task, because breaths are fuel. Then she stepped back so that the aisle could become a river again. People filed out into the winter night where buses idled with heat turned high, where volunteers handed out wool caps and thin gloves from bins filled by a community that had been taught by storms how to be ready. In the terminal, a coffee kiosk that had long since closed reopened its shutters 2 notches to press warm cups into stiff hands. No charge, the barista said, and the tip jar overflowed with folded bills anyway. A grandmother called her daughter and said, "I am fine, honey," and then said nothing else for a long moment, letting the line be full of breath and gratitude. By the time the last passenger left the jet, night had hardened into morning's blonde edge. Paperwork began where adrenaline ended. Statements were taken. Quiet compliments were exchanged among professionals who likely never see one another again and would nevertheless recognize one another across years when asked to serve on a tough day. Rodriguez sent one last message over the frequency. A simple good job that felt like an old friend's hand on the shoulder. General Collins' office forwarded a note with a kind of brevity that holds respect. You and yours did well. Weeks turned into months the way winter turns into the slow defrost of spring. The captain recovered, a little amazed and a lot grateful. Ethan moved through check rides with a steadier hand and a quieter pride, returning again and again to the lesson that kindness is a flight control. Dr. Park gave a grand rounds lecture titled The Music of Calm and told a story that made young clinicians stop taking notes and start listening with their spines. The crew received a letter that would be framed in break rooms and families, living rooms, written in a tidy hand by a boy who said he had drawn an airplane once and now wanted to learn the language of the sky. As for Danielle, honors were offered and accepted with the grace of a person who understands that medals are mirrors more than they are crowns. The air arm that had once trained her invited her back to teach a module with a practical name and an unteachable heart, and the regulator asked whether a few phrases from her night might live in handbooks for those who would one day meet their own dark corridors. She wore her uniform when it helped others hear her more quickly, and wore jeans when it helped them remember that excellence does not always dress up. Not all stories end in harmony for every character who walked through them. The videos of Gregory's worst words lived like eyes under certain search results, and his business partners learned that reputations are also aircraft that require careful piloting. He discovered what a quiet lobby feels like at noon and what humility tastes like when you have to chew it slowly. Linda found that silence could be a firm friend, and she kept company with people whose respect for competence ran deeper than their affection for polish. On an evening in early summer, when the city air was warm enough to be generous and the sky over New Jersey held its light a little longer than it used to, a bus rolled past a billboard that 1,000 commuters saw each week without really looking. The ad had changed. A woman in uniform gazed out with a steadiness that felt both personal and civic at once. A boy in the back of the bus nudged his grandmother and pointed. She nodded and said that sometimes the world remembers what it should. Gregory, in a dealership polo and carrying a lunch bag that smelled faintly of last night's pasta, walked along the sidewalk and looked up without meaning to. The words on the board were simple and undebatable and, to him, newly heavy. Leadership has no color. It has character. When the storm had passed and the long night gave way to morning, what remained was not the memory of fear, but the quiet strengths of people who chose patience, trust, and care in the face of doubt. The story of that flight was never just about eyes on a runway or turbulence in the sky. It was about the weight of prejudice giving way to the steadiness of character, and the discovery that dignity can rise where arrogance falls. At its heart, the lesson is simple. Compassion and humility are the true engines of survival. And redemption begins when we dare to see beyond old divisions. Much like a lantern left glowing in a farmhouse window, a single act of grace can guide weary travelers home through even the darkest night. Take a moment to reflect on the quiet kindness that surrounds your own days, and if this story has touched your spirit, consider passing a little of that warmth forward to someone still waiting in the storm.